2 years ago, I posted a video on the birth, life, and impending death of the US dollar. In that video, I presented a visual timeline of when the US dollar was removed from the gold standard and followed it up with an explanation of the limited lifespan of fiat currencies, no matter how strong the nation is that initially backs them. But when I initially published the research 2 years ago, that video had people asking, what does fiat currency have to do with sheep? And for me, the answer is a lot, because up until 2020, I primarily thought of wealth in terms of how many of these I had in the banks. It was the events of 2020, primarily the mass handout of stimulus and the $3 trillion increase in national debt over just 3 months that showed me how quickly and almost effortlessly the value of the US dollar could be devalued. So at that particular point in time, I began to scan the horizon for things with historically durable value that I could put any extra dollars in. And I'm glad that I did, because today this dollar has roughly 26% less buying power than it did in 2020. In fact, say that you had $80 in the bank back in 2020. Here in 2025, that $80 has only $60 worth of equivalent buying power. So back in 2020, I had just $11,000 of surplus dollar bills in the bank as a debt-free person, and I chose to invest in sheep alongside a few beef steers as my first means of hedging what little bit of wealth that I had. Now, the argument is going to arise as to whether that's the best first choice or not, but regardless, that was my first choice, and for 3 primary reasons. Number 1, I had access to a land resource that I could lease. Number 2, cattle, especially the small kind, are historically the most durable forms of measuring wealth, second only to precious metals. And number 3, cattle are a dynamic asset, whereas silver and gold are not. And what this simply means is that 5 years after investing in roughly 20 sheep, my initial investment has compounded exponentially through the birth of miniature versions of my initial investment. Now, realistically, a con to sheep is that if they do die, you do lose your investment. In fact, click on the first link in the description of this video and I'll send you a free 1-hour video that discusses some of the ways our sheep did die and how I avoid it now. But overall, this means of diversification has had more pros than cons for me. I'm reposting the timeline again because I think it's even more important today than it was 5 years ago. I want to encourage you to share this video and especially consider sharing it with children, as many of the problems that are looming will really be theirs to face. Historically, global reserve currencies have a lifespan of around 100 years, and the dollar as the world's leading reserve currency celebrates its 81st birthday in 2025. In this video, we will look at 6 critical dates in the life of the US dollar, from its birth in 1914 to present day. These dates may provide you with insight on what kind of time remains for the world's leading reserve currency. Our first stop is in 1914. While the use of paper currency in the United States dates back to colonial America, the dollar as the currency we know it today was first printed in 1914, 1 year after the passing of the Federal Reserve Act and the simultaneous establishment of the Federal Reserve as the nation's central bank. At this point in time, the US dollar was backed by the gold standard, meaning each dollar was tied to a certain amount of gold, which stabilized its value overall. In 1933 was when the value of the US dollar took one of its first massive hits. In response to extreme deflation during the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt transitioned the dollar from the gold standard to the limited gold standard, which decreased the value of the dollar by 50% almost overnight. Now, at this time, the government did this through a mandatory buyback of privately owned gold, and by making it technically illegal to privately own gold in most cases. Through Executive Order 6102, all persons within the USA were required to turn in their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates, which were then purchased by the U.S. Treasury at a rate of $21.67 per troy ounce. Once all privately owned gold was in the possession of the U.S. Treasury, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. This increased the government valuation of gold from $21 to $35 US per ounce, immediately devaluing the US dollar by 50% through a single act of Congress. The next date in the life of the US dollar is 1944, when the dollar gained dominance on the world stage as the world's leading reserve currency. Now, the concept and function of a reserve currency can be confusing, but here's a simplified look at how it works in the real world. Let's say Mexico buys a boatload of goods from China, and when it comes time to pay, rather than issuing the invoice in yen, converting that invoice from yen to Mexican pesos, gathering the Mexican pesos to pay, converting the pesos to yen, then sending the payment to China. The transaction is instead conducted entirely in a reserve currency like the US dollar. China issues the invoice in US dollar, Mexico pulls from its reserve of US dollars and pays China directly. Because the US dollar is the world's leading reserve currency, every major country in the world has essentially more or less bank vaults full of US dollars. This simplifies the process of global trade and provides really a medium through which business can be conducted across borders. Before the US dollar, gold was that primary medium for trade. As World War II was winding down, delegates from the 44 allied nations came together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and signed an agreement that replaced gold with the US dollar as the world's leading reserve currency and the primary mediator through which international trade was conducted. It took the US dollar from, at that point in time, simply being a reserve currency to the world's leading reserve currency, which takes us back to the timeline. Our next stop is in 1971, when the US dollar was removed from the gold standard. By the late 1960s, the gold standard was becoming difficult to maintain. Gold remained stayed at a government valuation of $35 per ounce, which worked because, if you remember, since 1933, it was not legal for US citizens to purchase gold in its concentrated monetary form. However, a loophole, as it pertained to the Bretton Woods Agreement and the international gold market, was putting a significant strain on United States gold holdings. Whenever the price on the international market for gold would go above $35, international entities would have the incentive to turn in their US dollars for gold. And because the US dollar was still on the gold standard, the United States Treasury was obligated to honor the $35 per ounce price on the international market. Now, in wake of this problem, the Nixon and Ford administration eradicated the gold standard between 1971 and 1976. The definition of the dollar in terms of gold was removed from statute. The monetary system at that point became one of pure fiat money. Now, something worth mentioning here is that despite the dollar becoming a fiat currency, having nothing directly backing its value, the United States itself is a world leader in GDP, precious metals holdings, trade, and more. This gives the dollar an indirect value. However, removing the dollar from something like the gold standard removes the broader accountability necessary to maintain the value of the currency long term. To understand what this means, we need only to look at the past 5 years, in which fiscal policy and the mass printing of dollars has contributed to massive and almost uncontrollable inflation rates. Now, back to the timeline. After being removed from the gold standard, the dollar was left to float. At this point, President Ford legalized private gold ownership again. The price of gold on the public market skyrocketed from $42 per ounce in 1971 to $850 per ounce in 1980. That's a spike of 2,000% within just 9 years. But why did the US dollar not completely crash at this point? Well, number one, the US dollar was a global reserve currency, with the demand for the currency stabilizing it. And number two, just before removing the dollar's ties to gold, President Ford settled the petrodollar agreement with Saudi Arabia. Now, a simple summary of the petrodollar agreement is that the United States promised safety, military aid, and trade benefits to Saudi Arabia and virtually all of OPEC, the oil-producing nations of the world, in exchange for the commitment that these oil-producing nations would only sell their oil in US dollars. Now, this was an easy ask because the dollar was, and is, the leading global reserve currency. So all that the world needed to do at the time to comply was simply increase the amount of dollars they already kept in reserve. Now, this is key because fiat currency, like the US dollar, is stabilized by demand and not an actual commodity. And as a result, since 1973, the global demand for oil has been a primary stabilizer of the value of the dollar, because every country in the world must keep millions, if not billions of US dollars in reserve at all times in order to buy the oil their country needs to function. However, in 2023, countries such as China and Brazil began trading with Saudi Arabia directly in local denominations, Russia even citing in 2019 a de-dollarization agenda within its own country. Now, as of 2023, the US dollar still represents 80% of global oil trade. But at present, a variety of internal factors pose just as much a threat to the dollar as the external ones. Since being completely removed from the gold standard 50 years ago, the dollar has lost 99% of its purchasing power. In the past 5 years alone, cumulative rate of inflation has hit 26%. US national debt is projected to double in the next 10 years to $75 trillion. And just for fun, at its official government valuation, gold in the Fort Knox Gold Reserve would cover 21 hours worth of government spending. Something's gotta give, and I'd rather be a little bit diversified before it does. Watch this video next for how one family used their 7-acre homestead to escape much of the effects of the Great Depression. I'm so sure somebody's gonna go to the comments and tell me to buy Bitcoin. Why I breed sheep and not Bitcoin would have to be next for that one.